Welcome to the Green Medicine Podcast. In today's episode, I talk with environmental artist Jill Chism about how art can contribute to our well-being. How can art impact our understanding of the necessity of a relationship with the natural environment? From an artist's perspective, I talk to Jill about how she understands green medicine. In this interview, we explore the notion of oneness and interconnectedness and how that can be expressed through an art practice. Jill develops her artworks through feeling and deep observation rather than conceptually as a complete reversal from earlier approaches. She is not interested in having a signature style, as her approach is to be open and receptive to what she finds. Jill is working towards a solo exhibition in Gallery 1 at NORTHSITE Contemporary Arts in Cairns in August 2024, titled Remnants. Welcome, Jill, and thanks for joining us today on the Green Medicine program.
My pleasure, Barbara.
Jill, you've got an extensive background in the arts, including environmental arts. So when did you first get interested in using art as a medium to talk about the environment?
Well, it's, I've always, as a child, I think I've always been really interested in environment. I've spent a lot of time in the bush, like every Australian child, and a lot of time at the beach. And I think later in life I actually owned a yacht and I sailed the Whitsunday. So I've always had this sense of expansiveness, a sense of space. And when I finished my master's in Wollongong in 1992, I felt this I felt very drawn, if you like, to installation art, because installation art explores, art in terms of space. There's a kind of sense, there's a term site-specific art practice, which actually brings the site into the creation of the work. So it could be the gallery site. So you almost comment on the gallery site. But from my perspective, I was much more interested in looking at sites that were in the environment. So I think it was 1993, I actually did an installation at a place called the Pool of Peace, which is on Stanwell Tops in New South Wales. And it actually sits at the top of the escarpment. And it had a really interesting story. And I think this is where my interaction with environment kind of really took place, because I think what I understood, I did some research about the Pool of Peace and understood it had both an indigenous story, which was really interesting, but also it kind of was compounded by the fact that it was a suburb, lots had been divided up. So there was this Western concept of dividing space and structuring space, and yet there was this love story about two indigenous people from neighbouring tribes and how that was not allowed, if you like. And so what happened was they were killed and they were thrown into the pool. So the legend is that the red colour that's in the pool that goes, turns into a waterfall that goes over the escarpment is actually the blood of these two lovers from these neighbouring tribes. So I think at that stage I was thinking about how, these stories kind of don't really match, because there's this sense of claiming land, a sense of ownership, and yet there's this sense of a kind of narrative about land. So that was the beginning of thinking about the different ways in which we perceive environment. And then I think later on, I moved up to Cairns. After I did that Pool of Peace installation, I moved up to Cairns in, I think, 1994, and there was a really burgeoning art scene at that time. There was Kick Arts had started the year before. I immediately became a member because I was interested in cutting-edge art practice, and there was a lot of, electricity in the air about new art practices. So I got involved with Kick Arts and was in many of the shows that were curated by the members and visiting curators. And I think my next engagement, because we're talking about land and how artists work with land, how artists work with environment, and was when in 1996, Russell Millage had a project called Uncharted the River, and he asked artists who were living in the, like I was living at Machin's Beach at the time, to engage somehow with the river. How do you chart the river? How do you create work that's about a river? And so one of the things I did, because I had that yachting background and I'd kind of learnt how to do running fixes and chart my course, if you like, I started charting some of the objects that were found on the edge of the river. So, and I felt that was a way of actually, at that stage, of making us look at what's happening in that culture, in that environment. So there were old tractors that were kind of pouring into the river, and there was bits of concrete, and there was human detritus and things like that. So I started putting marks around those. There was actually a big house that looked like it was falling into the river at Rankin Sawmill. So I even put a big running fix around that house and got an aerial shot of it. So, in some ways, I think what I was doing was taking art back to the landscape and probably picking up a bit where land art took off in America in the 1960s.
Yeah, I was aware of land art, and I was going to ask you, well, what is the basic difference then between land art and environmental art?
Well, what happened in the 60s, there was like the American artists wanted to really stand out and become, important in the world scene, if you like, the global scene. So they started doing work where they were making marks on the earth, using the earth in a way as their canvas. So you'd find graders going out and digging holes, like a jagged line across a desert like the Nevada desert, and then they'd fill it with coal. Or in the case of Robert Smithson, he made a spiral jetty, for example, in Lake Utah. I think the thing that was really interesting, and people looking at land art will know this, is that these artists were making marks on the land, but there was no sense of an environmental angle on it. So, there was thousands of truckloads of dirt that were poured into this lake. And of course, later on there was an algae that was growing between the spirals, and still an amazing landmark, because, there's a sort of almost a sense of the cosmos, people looking down from the cosmos and looking at the landscape in a completely different way. But, they did things like they tipped bitumen down a hill so they can make lines in the earth on a hill. So that was, for environmental artists today, an absolute anathema, because we're on the brink, we're in the tipping point at the moment. And I think, there's a lot of art around the world that's kind of making, using art as a way to kind of make meaningful statements about some of these huge issues, global issues that we're facing at the moment. At that stage, I think, when I was doing that earlier work, I didn't really have a sense of, how huge an impact that these kind of environmental disasters were having.
And so I know that you were also at that time engaged in doing the Great Walks. Can you talk about that, the development of that?
Yes, I think that was a bit of a turning point for me. So what happened was the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, opened up a series of walks along the Queensland coast, and they engaged an artist in certain areas along the Queensland coast to comment on that walk. So it was like such an amazing project, because for me, again, it took me out into the environment. And I think what I did, I was actually the only artist who was engaged in this project to actually walk the walk, because I felt that, the only way you're going to actually understand what's going on in a walk is to actually engage in the walk. And it was a 50-kilometre walk. There was a lot of things that went wrong because they hadn't finished the walk. But one of the things that I noticed is that in walking, there's a sense of where you lose yourself. When you're in the environment, and there's a sense where you lose yourself, you lose who you are. There's no sense of identification anymore. You can't say, I'm Jill, the famous artist, I'm something. You're actually just engaging in your moment by moment, I suppose, experience.
So is it an opportunity in a way to drop this whole identity of who we think we are as well, when we're immersed in nature and,
Yes, and I think, it kind of, I wrote a poem called Marking Time, and it was about that, losing that sense of baggage about who you are, and then there's a sort of openness, a sense of connection that opens up. You have a sense of, there's an immediacy and there's an openness, And I think that was the first time that I really, explored something a little bit different in this, if you like, environmental art practice that was emerging.
Because you talk quite a bit too in some of your work about oneness, and so is that something that's started to come out of, your art practice from immersing yourself in nature?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think oneness, I realise that we, often talk about oneness, and it's fairly conceptual. Most people don't really understand oneness, because I think oneness is a complete, where you completely lose yourself. And I think art, any sort of art, writing, there's an opportunity to lose yourself in an environment by doing deep listening. I know you use that term in green medicine, or Aboriginal. You got that from an Aboriginal person.
Dajara, which means deep listening.
That's right.
Which is really, a profound connection with the country that you're in.
Yes.
And a loss of self and, an immersion with the country.
Yeah, that's right. So I think that writers and artists use the right side of their brain. This is the other thing that's interesting. The left side of the brain, as we know from neuroanatomists, like Jill Taylor, for example, who discovered this when she had a
stroke.
Yeah, she had a stroke. And so basically she was only operating from the right side of her brain, and all she felt was connection. She couldn't actually do anything. She couldn't add up. She couldn't even name herself.
She couldn't talk
or
anything.
She couldn't talk, that's right. So it's kind of interesting that art and writing and, the arts have the opportunity to access that side of the brain, and I think there's a lot more that we understand about that side of the brain now. And I think this is part of the brain that you use when you really want to understand or feel or even engage intuitively with environment. I actually did a project in 2007 where it's actually following the Great Walks project, where Arts Queensland gave me a fellowship. It was fabulous, because I did 4 years where I just engaged at different water locations on the Queensland coast with different galleries and different groups of artists. And we went out and actually went to sites, and I think at that stage I was much more aware of that deep listening that we just talked about, not just going there and just, imposing an idea on a site, but actually...
What was the name of that project?
That was called Water's Edge.
Water's Edge.
Creating environments.
Yes.
I went to 5 different regions, and all the different artists had kind of different ideas about the site and what they wanted to bring to it, and maybe, the part that humans had played. And I think the other thing that started emerging, not only were we kind of listening and looking at what was going on at the site and creating work in response to that, we're also aware of the issues that were starting to become more dominant and more evident. Things like we went to Broken River in Mackay, and there were high levels of E. coli in the water, to the point where, it was threatening the platypus population. There were a lot of dairy farms around, so there were even signs up at Broken River saying, don't swim in the water. So artists started making E. coli, things that looked a bit like E. coli, and sort of layering them out in the water. And I made a work, I remember at that point, where I just got these glass mirrors and made them float. And I actually had a chant. What was it? Pure, clean, flowing
water
source, thank you. Pure, clean, flowing source, thank you. And I actually it was a bit hippie-like. We got sort of a group of people and we all chanted that to the river as a way of, thinking even about people like Matsuru Emoto, who actually did a lot of work on rivers and water and lakes, where he was able to change what was happening in the streams or the water by actually chanting. I'm sure you're aware of that, where he used to...
I am. But what you're talking about, it's not that far-fetched when you think about now. We're actually giving rivers legal, identities, aren't we?
Well, I think that's because what's happening is we're just destroying them so much, I think, one of the things is, I think it's the Amazon. The Amazon River's actually got a legal identity now, and I think
there's
the
one in New
reason
Zealand
for that,
too, the Wanganui River, and there's
Right.
other rivers systems as well.
Yeah, that's right.
So
I mean, this became, look, the two things came together really in a way. The issues, environmental issues, how huge they are now, and how important it is for art to be meaningful. We need to be addressing some of these issues, working at a site. With a site, in a site-specific way, is a kind of really important way to work, because we can talk about those issues and bring them out in the site, so that viewers get to come to the site and actually really experience what's happening there. There's both the magic of what can happen in the environment, but there's also the potential disaster that's kind of waiting in the
well, it's already arrived really in many ways, hasn't it?
That's right.
So, like in 2017 you initiated Call of the Running Tide. So can you tell us about that as well?
Well, I think that came out of all this other experience. With Call of the Running Tide, I was at the time living in Oak Beach, and absolutely beautiful location with heritage protected rainforest, but very aware that there had been, a lot of protests in the early 80s for the Daintree not to be destroyed, because I think it was the time of Joh Bjelke-Petersen, and I think what was happening there was they were going to put a massive road straight through the Daintree, and they hadn't done any kind of prep planning with engineers and that sort of thing. So there was going to be an absolutely massive destruction of that Daintree rainforest. And simultaneously, there were scientists who were finding out about how old these plants were. Same time that there was like a huge protest of hippies who came up and started doing things like, when the road started coming through, they'd jump on the bulldozers, blades of the bulldozers, and bury themselves up to their necks, and, put balls around their,
chains,
balls and chains around their legs, and and so they'd come along. There'd just be a head, and there'd be a chain attached to their foot that took them way down a hole, So there was this kind of even that, and that of course got a lot of media exposure. So I think what happened for me when I got to Oak Beach was I realised that this basically demise of the environment, if you like, is still going on, because now, post-COVID, we've got a bigger population up there. If you go up to Port Douglas, for example, which is only 1 hour from this heritage-listed rainforest, that even Joh Bjelke-Petersen called a living museum in the end, then, there's still this sense of, needing to protect, needing to kind of do something, and as an artist, I felt it was really important that instead of just doing pictures about how beautiful the reef was or how wonderful the rainforest is, people like those pictures because then they don't have to think, or they don't have to kind of engage. I felt it was important to do something that was about the issues. So one of the things was to get environmental groups involved. So I ran workshops. I got as many local artists who are ready to kind of explore a new type of art practice, working with ephemeral materials and engaging in a site-specific way to get together. And I taught them basically, because I've got this education background, about environmental art practice and what's involved. So one of the key aspects of Call of the Running Tide was it had an educational emphasis. So when artists came to the workshops in the prior year to the event, they would be taught about environmental art, its historical, background, and also what it is in terms of, that whole engagement as an artist with a site, rather than creating a painting or a drawing or something like that.
Was that challenging for artists? Was that like a new concept for artists?
A lot of them. In fact, it was interesting, over half the artists hadn't worked like that. And some of them had a most meticulous practice in another area. But I think it was interesting because one of the things about this exhibition was it wasn't for sale. And I think what happens with artists and creatives is they have a concept in their head of how it must be for sale. So there was nothing for sale, so they could let go of that whole idea and just really explore a site from what it had to offer. So there was that thing I was talking about earlier where you work with the right side of your brain rather than, thinking about, how is this going to look for me as an artist, or is this work going to sell? Some artists received a fee for Call of the Running Tide, and I think that stimulated them to create work that was simply about the environment or simply about the site and the issues that were explored. And the other half were clearly instructed that that was the way this project was going. Because I think if you look at a lot of the ephemeral art events along the East Coast, those events are often about selling a huge sculpture to somebody. And this was different. It was actually about environment. It was about looking at the health of the environment, which I know you'd appreciate. It was looking at what the issues are, how we can bring these to people through art. Art had that significance in this project, and there was a lot of response to it. One of the things too was the environmental groups. We had basically 5 environmental groups come and present to artists. These were, for instance, Tangarara Blue. Tangarara Blue works in both Port Douglas and Perth, and their mission is to clean up the beaches, stop plastic from going in and out with the tide. And they've, like recently they went to Cape York and they collected on the west coast of Cape York 72 tonnes of plastic which were airlifted out from beaches in that area, never been cleaned up. They provided us with some of the material, and that became important material for the artists. We actually had free rein to go into their shipping containers and find plastic and things to whatever objects there were that had floated up on the beach.
So, what was the public's response to Call of the Running Tide?
Public were really receptive. I think what's happening, a lot of artists said, look, we're just preaching to the converted. But it was interesting, the amount of people that came to the first festival in 2019. There were 6,000 people that entered and looked in at the work that was at that stage in the community hall, which was completely about ephemeral. We couldn't use anything except for ephemeral material. And then there was work out in specific sites like Rexmill Park, near the Sugar Wharf, up on Flagstaff Hill Walk. And people were really receptive. And some of them, I remember a backpacker saying at one point, how do you get away with this? Because it wasn't just pretty art, it was art. There was in the 2021 festival, there was this massive wall of thongs. I can't remember, 5,000 thongs. I can't remember how many there were, but it looked like a massive weaving. And I think when people came and saw that, they were completely intrigued.
It was an incredible piece.
It was an incredible piece, and I think, so people were highly responsive. About 10,000 people attended that.
I know I was a volunteer on the Call of the Running Tide, and a lot of people who came from, out of Cairns, like from Melbourne and Sydney and Adelaide, were commenting on the level of professionalism, and a lot of people said, look, this hasn't got an international sort of standing. I think people were really impressed with the quality for a show that was, a regional show, really. Yes,
I think it was because artists were challenged. I think artists were guided. I think that was really important. Mentored. We visited studios, looked at artists' work in their studios. There wasn't this hands-off, look, produce something and throw it in the show, which often happens. There was a real sense of, this is important, let's see that we can give it our best. And I think that's why it looked its best. Some work was kind of on that amateurish edge, but we also had professional artists involved who've been doing environmental art for a while, and of course, their work was outstanding. So, it was great. It's a great success.
Yeah, well, we're going to look forward to more Call of the Running Tide festivals, and I know that after Call of the Running Tide you were involved in an exhibition, a group exhibition called Confounded, and I was just interested to find out what that exhibition was about.
Interesting, because after Call of the Running Tide I was pretty worn out, to be honest. I had been, the master of what like one of those street buskers who has everything, the drum, the cymbals, the horn, the tapping his foot, the singer, the everything. And honestly, at that stage I just about fell over. I had a coordinator working with me and she said, "That's it, I'm out. You've lost me." So
burnt out.
One of the things that I was doing at that time, I did I had a series of very deeply profound meetings with a spiritual teacher, and it was timely because I think one of the things that happened for me was a big part of my, if you like, ego self, the one that's kind of been operating and upholding all of these projects for so long, seemed to slough off, and I became much more open and more, heartfelt about my interaction with everything, everyone, everything. And it comes back. It's interesting. I had that visceral experience of what you were talking about when you're talking about oneness, and there's a sense where some of this stuff had slipped away, and I was able to really sense my connectedness to environment and to other people.
So was it, would you describe it as a shift in perception or consciousness?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's one way of talking about it, but it felt like, like some part of myself had kind of just slipped away, and there was kind of a deeper kind of, something deeper came through that. And actually after that, coming back to Confounded, what happened was I started to think about art quite differently. I was already thinking about art differently, and I'd already for a long time not wanted to actually feel that I had an audience, and that audience or that viewer was liking what I was doing. I was always very careful to kind of create work that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than that. It wasn't about selling work. Most of my work is not selling work. It's about concepts and meaning and all those sort of things. But I think one of the things that started happening was I kind of lost almost like I didn't care, and that sounds like it's not carelessness. I didn't care where the work ended. So what I ended up doing was going into the studio and just using anything that I saw in there.
So you weren't so invested.
I wasn't invested.
Yeah. So
there was no audience, I didn't think about an audience. I thought, look, I'm just going to let this happen. And I didn't know where the work was going, so I ended up creating a series of assemblages out of some old driftwood that I had from the beach, and bits and pieces of public art, because I've been doing a lot of public artwork, and it just ended up pulling together. And some of the deep experiences I'd had when I had that personal experience came in as text. That's one of the things that I've often brought into work, is text, as kind of sayings, if you like. And I mean, I don't even know what they look like today. I haven't even got a concept for how they fit in with the art, with art styles or anything like that. And I think I was always conscious of that as an educator. How does this fit in? What is this, post whatever, post pop, post, environmental art at the end of the age, this sort of thing.
Do you think anyway that's where real creativity comes from, when we, drop away from the mind, the intellect, conceptual side of ourselves, and more into a heart-based way of being?
Absolutely. I think that's, and it's interesting because that translates. Because people often, you go into a show, local town, like Babinda where we are today, and there might be, you look at work and it might be an amateur that's creating that work, but there's kind of a passion, there's a sort of a passion or almost a love thing that goes into the creation of this work that gets transpired to the viewer. So the viewer goes, oh, okay, there's something in this, and it might just be very amateurish, but there's a liveliness or an aliveness, I'd say, to that work.
Spontaneity.
Yeah, and less contrived, less self-conscious. I mean, I think when as an art educator, one of the things that I noticed about students was how self-conscious they were, mostly because, this work is going to say something about me. As soon as you lose that and you're working instead, that's the left side of the brain, then you start working the right side of the brain. How's this material working? What sort of mark is going to appear on the page? And there's something more essential, then I think, you can create something that's absolutely amazing,
Yeah, very interesting. And I know these themes that you're talking about will probably be carried over to your solo exhibition that you're having in 2024, Remnants.
Yes, I think Remnants, again, follows along on the ecological theme. So there's the work is remnants. Actually, they're bits and pieces from the studio. They're gifted wood objects that people have given to me. I'm actually looking at wood objects. Interestingly enough, have started working with wood. I think there's something quite sensuous about wood, and not only that, it speaks of deforestation, of how, we're now replacing forests with urban projects, building projects, and there's a kind of sadness about that. So I think for me, living in the bush and knowing what creatures are there and having that sense of those eco-environments has spurred me on to create work that's about that kind of speaks to that somehow. So using wood from skips, like we've got so many building projects going on in Port Douglas. I've been diving down into skips, not my most favourite pastime, but I think it's just amazing what you find in there in terms of even just what surfaces there are on wood. And so I've been making life-size one-to-one sculptures that we interact with. I'm going to have, we've got the gallery one on the niche for next year. So in the niche there'll be these probably about 14 of these life-size wooden sculptures, and I'm realising they're starting to take on kind of character. So I've started naming them things because of what the wood is, kind of how the wood's speaking to the with the sculpture. So there's an ecological emphasis, but there's also, I think, in that a sense of, there's a sadness in there about what's happening to the environment. There's a work I'm doing in there, which I'm calling placeless. And what it is at this stage is like I've built three houses, like the frames of three houses that are life-size that you interact with. And so it's almost like coming to a building site. And then in there is a Rumi poem about what placeless is. There's a lot of people who feel placeless, like they haven't got a place.
There's also a lot of people who are homeless because now this is a big issue that, we're facing since, post-COVID. So, we're talking about lots of different social issues at this time.
That's right. So here I bring in those issues, but also the more transpersonal aspect of it, which is where we are actually all placeless. And it's actually only as we understand that we are placeless that we can free flow, like the poem goes something like, you lose your place to become placeless, you lose yourself to become selfless, and then you flow like water down a stream. It's like, in a way, when you start losing these kind of dearly held notions of who you are, when you kind of become placeless in that respect, then life opens up and becomes much more vibrant and
much more flowing.
Yeah, flowing. So I've got these double meanings in the work.
Of course. So, like we've talked extensively about, your art practice and your history. What's the meeting point with your art practice and green medicine? How do you see the interrelationship?
Well, I think the way that in this history, I suppose, of my practice, there's very much a link in with green medicine, because it's about how the environment, how if we actually really look in, or if we're really there in these beautiful environments, then to some extent we're healing ourselves because we're coming back home. Like we are all organic beings. So as we interact with the organic ecosystems, then we're fully at home. Now, I think you and I were talking about Shinrin-yoku, which means forest bathing. You use that a lot in green medicine, and I know that it means that there was in Japan a survey, a randomly held trials for people entering the forest. And these trials, they measured their blood pressure before they went into the forest, measured it when they came out. And of course, there were all these significant factors that you'd know about, physical factors that had come into balance or had, some of their blood pressure dropped, all sorts of things.
That's right. There were a lot of biological, physiological changes, even, so much evidence of people's mental health, where people were feeling a lot calmer, less anxious. And the Japanese government was very engaged in, bringing that into the public arena, and now it's become very well known.
And I think that's the same as losing yourself. That's the same as going into the forest. And I think it happens. What was the name of that woman who did that with the camels? She walked with the camels.
Robin Davidson.
Robin Davidson. I remember...
In the 80s.
In the 80s. Robin Davidson did this massive walk across Australia with the camels, and she entered that space where she lost herself and she became connected to the landscape and the cosmos.
And the animals that she was with.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it was, kind of really significant. So I think definitely health and art in these cases have met together,
That's great. Well, look, thank you very much, Jill, for joining us today on the Green Medicine podcast. If people want to find out more about you and your work, where can they find that information?
Well, they can find out from my old website, but I have a public art website, jillchism.com.au, and I have an environmental art website that is envart.jillchism.com.au, and then I think the other thing is to go to Call of the Running Tide.
Yes.
Call of the Running Tide has a website as well, and it's just calloftherunningtide.com.au. So I think, people will find out things there.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Barbara Malarski is a doctor of Chinese medicine with 25 years clinical expertise. She has a teaching background, establishing a natural therapies program in Cairns, far North Queensland, Australia, where she trained over 750 students in remedial massage and oriental health medicine. Her other passion developed through working with First Nations people in New Zealand, where she was born, and 3 decades in Australia on Cape York and in New South Wales, working with indigenous and Torres Strait Islander communities. These experiences have enriched her life through deep connection with people and the environments they live in. Barbara resides in Oak Beach, far North Queensland, on 2 acres of forest that border World Heritage listed forest. She sees herself as a privileged custodian.